Good afternoon for everyone. Yeah, today we have a pleasure to receive Professor Mark Horridge. Yeah, from the Center of Policy Studies. Yeah, from Victoria University in Melbourne. Yeah, Professor Mark Horridge has a long experience in computable general equilibrium modeling. Yeah, he's one of the most important researcher, yeah, in the world in the field of general equilibrium modeling. Yeah, we have here as well our colleague from Embrapa, senior research in Embrapa, and as well contributing as a professor here in the Institute of Economics, yeah, and in the Faculty of Mechanical Engineering, yeah, Geraldo Marta, yeah. So, Professor, take your time, yeah, and later we'll open, yeah, the discussion for the audience.
Okay, so this talk is not very technical. There's no equations at all. It's more a talk about institutional history and how it came to be that a particular branch of economics, computer general equilibrium modeling, came to be very important in Australia, and how our centre was very much part of that movement and continues to be so. Okay, so I'm from Centre of Policy Studies, Victoria University, that's in Melbourne, for those who are not quite sure about Australia. Yes, and the centre has two remarkable characteristics. One is we concentrate purely on CGE modelling, which is unusual. We're not at all a multidisciplinary centre. And the second unusual thing is that we don't rely on the government for money. All the money has to come from consulting jobs or selling software, or to a small extent by running courses. So this gives us, of course, it's very hard work to raise all this money, but it does give us some leverage with university administrators, because actually they're not paying us. Yes, they just get some credit if we publish something. Yes, and so what are some reasons we're very well known as the Centre of CGE Modelling? Well, it's the large team composed to a large extent of people who've been with the team for 20, 30, 40, even 50 years. And I would say quite a happy team. Yes, workplace harmony is definitely one factor in our success. Why does that have to be? Because a CGE model, a serious CGE model, which will impress people who are not enthusiasts, requires a lot of investment. Perhaps it would take 2 or 3 years to construct a serious CGE model of, say, Brazil. So in order to, if you made that investment, you have to be using the model quite a lot to pay for the initial investment. And therefore you're going to need a big team, and you're going to need specialists in this team. So we have specialists on data, specialists on computing, specialists in being charming to the customers. So this is why we have to have a big group. But also, as I'll be talking about, some special features of the Australian history and context. So that is my talk plan. Okay, so this is just a picture of Australia. I'm always trying to impress on people how 90% of our great country is desert. Only in this little bit here do we get regular rainfall throughout the year. The rest is extremely dry. And here are some little comparisons of Australia and Brazil. So you'll see there, Australia is about the same size as Brazil, but Brazil has 9 times the population. In both cases, the average age of the population is fairly low, at least by European standards. Yes, the GDP is not too different for the two countries, but we won twice as many medals as you. And this again is showing the population of distribution, very heavily concentrated in this little strip where the rain is. Okay, so how did Australia start out? So before 1900, Australia consisted of 6 colonies of Britain, and these colonies were effectively self-governing, but they relied on Great Britain for the army, the navy, and diplomatic services. And after a lot of discussion, they decided to join together to form Australia. So during the discussions, it was thought that New Zealand might be part of the Federation, or even Fiji. But in the end, it was just Australia. And these were some of the big issues that were discussed at the time of Federation. Yes, the need to have some sort of national army. So at this time it was thought, it seems ridiculous now, but it was thought that possibly Russia might be about to invade Australia. So we needed to have some system of defense against Russia. The question of who the population of Australia was going to be. Yes, so similar to Brazil at that time, there was a discussion about whether Australia should be a white country or an Asian country. Yes, and they agreed on this white Australia policy, which meant, by the way, so part of the discussion about white Australia policy, we never had slaves in Australia, but we did have these visiting workers from the Pacific Islands, and they were the ones who were cutting the sugar cane. So they had to be sent home. So in return, it's part of Australian political custom that whatever happens, we will support the sugar industry. Yes, so the sugar industry had to be subsidized because the black workers were sent back to the Pacific Island. And then this very big issue, the free trade issue, whether to allow imports to be delivered at world prices, or alternatively to put a big tax on imports, associated with free trade in New South Wales, where Sydney is, or the tariff lobby located in my state of Victoria. And on this issue, the protectionists won. And after that, for 60 or 70 years, we had very high tariff protection. Yes, so what this meant was either very large taxes on imports or quotas, which were designed to support Australian manufacturing industry, such as agricultural machinery, textiles, most of the manufacturers. And up to 1972, both main political parties were in favour of this tariff protection, even though economists were moving against it. And not only economists, I would say. Yes, so the economists said that if you have a tax on imported machinery, say, or imported clothing, that will indirectly increase the production costs of farmers and miners, reducing their exports, make certain consumer goods more expensive to households. And in the analyses that were done at that time, it would seem that the protection would a little bit lower GDP. Yes, and I should say, just like Brazil, Australia's main exports are mining and agricultural products. Very similar in that way. Yes, so as this was realised, the farmers and miners began to demand some sort of compensation for the tariff policy. So there were these offsetting distortions, which were intended to counteract the tariffs and help the farmers and miners. Yes, so for example, things like this. So what this means is our Australian sugar industry is uncompetitive on the world market, but it has to exist. So imports of sugar will be banned, and all Australians who use sugar will pay a very high price, and this will be used to subsidise the exports. So this was one of the schemes that they had to help the farmers. And all of this, these different subsidies and tariffs and quotas, were controlled by this organisation called the Tariff Board, which, as you can imagine, was in a position to give political favours to one group of society or another, and became very powerful. Okay, so this little diagram shows you how the government of Australia has moved between centre-right and centre-left during the last 120 years. So you can see it alternates generally, but the significant feature is from around 1950 up to 1972, we had a very long period of centre-right government, which was a sort of intellectual straitjacket, or you might say a long drunken sleep of the intellect. And by the end of that time, everyone was hoping for a change and open to all sorts of new ideas. Yes, and that is about the time our project started. Yes, so in 1972, finally we had a centre-left government again. And while the centre-right government had no particular interest in experts or technical expertise or university professors, the centre-left had the opposite idea that many experts should be consulted to find a new way forward. So it was an opportunity for the university sector to influence policy in a small way. And the consensus amongst academics at that time was that this tariff protection system was a problem. But if we didn't have the tariffs, they thought this would cause a lot of pain to certain occupational groups, to certain industries, to certain regions, and also to demographic groups. Yeah, so the famous example was in my suburb in Melbourne, there were many textile factories, and these textile factories were full of Greek women. So Melbourne is the second biggest Greek city in the world after Athens. And it was thought that if we reduced the tariff on clothing, these factories would close, and then unemployment would be concentrated on this group of Greek women, all in one little region, causing a problem. So the idea was to see if we could develop tools to quantify this problem and see if it was actually as bad as people thought. Okay, so this guy, Rattigan, was appointed to be director of the Tariff Board in 1963. And it was said that they appointed him because he always worked hard, he never caused a problem, and he always did what he was told. But he caused a surprise. So after he became the head of the Tariff Board, he suddenly became a critic of protection and organized various ways in which we could see what the damage of protection was. So he was looking for economic tools which would tell us both the short and the long run effects of any economic policy, but including removing tariffs. And for example, when he came in, our input-output table, I think, had 45 sectors or something. He said this was not enough. We had to have a lot more detail in the manufacturing sectors. And so the input-output tables were expanded to have 110 sectors, I think it was. So here I mention so two of the people who founded our project. First, Alan Powell, who had two strong interests. So the first was he thought there should be a link or nexus between academic or university economics and the political system. And he was interested in these multi-sectoral models. And then Peter Dixon, his student, who went away to do a PhD in USA, and his supervisor was Leontiev, already at that time quite old, but still active. Yes, so at Monash, Powell, with some assistance, he did construct an economy-wide multi-sectoral model using the linear programming paradigm. So So at the time, it was thought impossible or very difficult to solve a system of, let us say, 10,000 nonlinear simultaneous equations. Yes, to find a solution to such a large system of equations was very hard. And the linear programming approach was one way of doing that, which had been seen to work. And so that's one they chose. However, they didn't manage their media section very well. They caused controversy in Parliament, and the project collapsed. But this did not discourage Professor Alan Powell. He continued searching and lobbying politicians and others to try and set up a bigger project. Yes, so here are these two I mentioned, Alan Powell and Peter Dixon. Okay, so then the government changed from the centre right to the centre left. And this meant that many doors opened in government to people from universities. At the same time, Dixon completed his thesis and returned to Australia. And Powell finally succeeded in persuading the government to set up quite a large institute for developing economic tools which could be used to simulate different policies. And there were 4 tools he was supposed to develop: a conventional time series macro model, a demographic model, a long-run multi-sectoral model based on linear programming, and another CGE or multi-sectoral model which could handle short-run effects. So up to that time, CGE modeling was all about long-run effects, not short-run effects. And Dixon was the leader of the last team making the short-run CGE model. Yes, so it's said that to get the final funding decision, they pursued the federal treasurer, but he was so busy he would only agree to meet them on the toilet. So they had to present their arguments while he was sitting there, but he said yes. Yes, so the impact project was set up to build those 4 models. And at the same time, the country had an inflation problem, and the Labour government decided to reduce tariffs by 25%, not because they're a bad idea economically, but merely to try to reduce inflation. So this was a very useful natural experiment that we don't often see, a sudden reduction in all the tariffs, and yes, giving us some sort of evidence as to what the effect of the tariffs is. Yes, but the era of centre-left turned out to be quite short, and almost as soon as the impact project was set up and working, the government changed, and the new centre-right government was not much interested in what economists had to say. But still, the project continued for 3 years. And Dixon in particular made quite a lot of progress with a rather multidisciplinary team. Yes, so this is partly a joke. I'm sure it's, well, first of all, in Australian economics, agricultural economists have always played a leading role. And secondly, quite different to Brazil, in Australia, the agricultural economists are famous for drinking too much and swapping wives. But anyway, as well as them, we needed computer expertise. At that time, in order to get computer expertise, you had to hire a scientist. Nobody else knew. So there were those and other sorts of people. And a number of studies were done on the effects of tariff reduction, addressing the concerns that if the tariffs were reduced, that would concentrate the pain on particular small groups. Yes, but especially at first, there was general skepticism towards the CGE model. People didn't know what it was. Yes, so yes, so it was quite hard work at first, I would say, to convince people about it. Okay, so I think I see there's one or two people in the audience, possibly, who knows what a line printer is. So this is a type of computer output that was the only computer output up till the 1970s. And it's showing us the projected effect of a tariff rise, because after the 25% tariff reduction, and after inflation had receded, they raised the tariffs again. Yes, and it's trying to show how the tariff rise impacts on different occupational groups in different regions. So you'll see if you look here that only one column is mainly positive. That's Victoria. So Victoria generally gains from the tariff because that was where the manufacturing was concentrated. But some other state, like West Australia, which is concentrating on mining, the tariff rise, because it raises the production costs of industries, is bad for exporters who are facing a fixed world price. Yes, so the pain is concentrated in WA. Okay, so the tariff board evolved to be less focused on tariffs, and it adopted a new political role. So it was designed to be impartial and insulated from ministerial control. So no minister or politician could tell the Industries Assistance Commission what to do. And this led to a typical scenario. So some interest group says that they need some sort of protection or a subsidy. And the minister is probably not sympathetic, but he doesn't like to say that. So he says, oh, we'll ask the Industry Assistance Commission what they think. So he would request the IAC to look at this idea. The IAC would evaluate the policy, often using the CGE model, And the typical conclusion would be that this subsidy for some industry is very good for that industry, but a little bit bad for the rest of the economy, so that looking at Australia as a whole, there's either a zero or negative effect. So then the minister tells the lobbyists, oh, I thought your idea was great, but the IAC have rejected it, unfortunately, so we have to say no. So you can see this is quite a useful thing for a minister to have, a polite way to say no. And it kept changing its name. So now it's called Productivity Commission. Okay, so this is 2 or 3 slides for those who have no idea what a CGE model is. I told you that the inventor of the Irani model studied under Leontiev. So it's not surprising these models have a very close relationship to input-output models. But in the input-output models, the inputs are proportional to the outputs. But in a CGE model, prices can have some influence on the input proportions. Yes, so for example, we could stimulate demand in these models. It might be that the supply of fixed labour, the supply of skilled labour was fixed in the short term, so that would be a problem for your input-output model. But if we allow price changes to influence the input mix of industries, then we can still increase output even though one of the inputs is fixed. Another very big difference is in the typical input-output model, most of final demand is just fixed, in particular exports. But that's very unrealistic, I think, for someone exporting a commodity on the world market. If anything, the prices are fixed, or the export demand curves are very flat, and the CGE model can easily model this situation. Yes, so that repeats some of the things I said. So it's characteristic of a CGE model that it has quite a lot of detail. Normally a number of sectors, but the detail could be in other directions, such as different social groups, different regions, or even different countries. So this gives rise to quite a large database and a very large number of simultaneous equations, and thus a solution problem. Yes, so if you take something like the GTAP world model of world trade, there's just no possibility of solving that using Excel. And there has to be a special tool or a special approach, which these days is usually provided by programs such as GAMS, GEMPAC, and maybe 1 or 2 others. Yes, so here are the typical equations of the CGE model. So the producer's demands for produced input resemble the similar equations for an input-output model, but now prices are doing something. The final demands were exogenous, in an input-output model, but now we have some equations to explain them. The CGE model typically, because it's using prices, it has to explain the difference between the prices as coming out of the factory and the prices that people pay in the shop. Yeah, so for example, well, everyone knows this sort of example. So now in Australia, they're saying that because of the rise in coffee prices, it's necessary to charge $8 for a cup of coffee, and yet the guy who grows it is only going to get 30 cents. Okay, so the model has to explain the difference between the producer coffee at 30 cents and the coffee in the shop at $8 or whatever. And that's what these equations will be doing. The general flavor of a CGE model can be neoclassical, and in some of them they are very neoclassical, but in most of them they're only partly neoclassical, particularly in the Australian tradition. There's also a strong element of pragmatism. For example, modeling slack labour markets where wages are rigid and employment is elastic, responding to the Australian political situation, and in other countries different adaptations would be made. This, however, is quite common. This produces pricing at marginal cost idea. Yes, so some people would say that was unrealistic, but I say if you think the profit margins are approximately constant, this assumption is fairly harmless. Okay, so when do we need a CGE model? So many government bureaus who are supposed to be advising politicians, they have to decide what type of model they're going to use. And if the policy question was, what effect does the rise in interest rates have on investment, probably they wouldn't choose a CGE model, because that is more like a question for a macro model. But when we have a policy like the tariff, which assists one or two sectors, but damages all the others a little bit, when it becomes necessary to model the interaction between different sectors, well, then we need some sort of multi-sectoral model, and the CGE model starts to be attractive, or even the only choice. So what made the Irani model back in 1978 an unusual or path-breaking model? Well, you've got to consider two things. The very limited computer resources of the time, making it difficult to solve large systems of equations, and strongly motivating the modeler to assume that all primary factors were completely mobile between all sectors. So, yes, so to solve the CGE model, we need to know a number of relative prices. Before Irani, essentially, there were only 3 independent prices in the economy. So the output price of each industry was an average of the price of labor, the price of capital, and the price of imports. So if you knew what was happening to the prices of labor, capital, and imports, you could solve the model. So when I say the price of labor, I'm assuming that labor is completely mobile between industries, and the same for capital. Yes, so so such a model you could solve in Excel, probably with some difficulty, because you could just experiment with different combinations of the price of labor, the price of capital, and the price of imports until you manage to solve the model. But as soon as we say that some primary factors are temporarily frozen in an industry, such as capital, such as land, that means that those factors have a unique price in that industry. And instead of just having 3 prices that we must choose between, we start to have maybe 200. And the whole moderate computational problem becomes much harder. But this is what we must do if we wish to simulate the short-run impacts of a policy, or to try to model adjustment costs of various sorts. Yes, so this was very special, and this was pretty surprising at the time, that we could have so many sectors. Another novelty was, before, most CGE models, and even today, this is sort of true, there's only one closure. The choice of exogenous variables is part of the model. So you could see that again in the GTAP model. They tell you what the closure is. But in Iran, it was emphasized that you could choose many different closures according to the assumptions you wanted to make, and the time scale of the simulation. And various other innovations too, like the CES sub-production function, a particular solution algorithm. So in CGE modeling, a usual feature is, because we have such a large system of equations, we assume that we already have one solution. And that solution is given to us by the input-output tables or the supply-use tables for a certain date. And we assume that these bits of data are consistent with the model. And that gives us a tremendous help in developing new solutions of the model. Because if you already have a solution to some equation system, it's quite easy to find a neighboring solution with some small changes in exogenous variables. And if you keep changing the exogenous variables a little bit, you can develop a large change solution. Yes, so here are some other things. The whole question of margins, as I was hinting before. Yes, so typically, in most countries, if you go and buy some fish in the shop, 2/3 of what you pay is transport, storage, and retail margin. So if you want to get the modeling right, you have to have that in the model. Okay, so this was Alan Powell's vision. So his idea was that the government would pay for this research program, and in return, the research output would be public and available to everyone. So the model code would be public, and indeed, anyone could run the model. So yeah, so back in 1978, in order to, well, we only had maybe 3 big computers in Australia. Maybe that big computer was as powerful as your mobile phone is today. But anyway, it was in Canberra, so you had to communicate with it using the telephone lines. And in theory, any member of the public could ring the supercomputer and run a simulation. Of course, that couldn't be true unless there was some system of training to help people understand and run the model. And these training courses started maybe in 1980. And typically they would consist of 25 or 30 PhD students, but more normally starting off employees of the economic ministries of government. Yes, so organizations like the Federal Treasury, they thought these training courses were an economical and effective training opportunity for their new employees. Yes, so you can imagine if you run training courses for the cleverest young government officials for 20 years, after a while you've got quite a lot of people in top jobs who went to one of these training courses and did understand something about CGE modeling, and might even be able to recognize when a particular problem was appropriate for CGE modeling or maybe inappropriate. This was a very part of it. And also his vision was that the people doing the modeling would continue to be able to regard themselves as academics, not just technicians. And that meant that they had to publish something so that they could be a normal academic. Yes, so this is what CGE modeling in the rest of the world was like, and maybe still is. So typically, you've only got, in a particular university, maybe 1 or 2 professors who are an enthusiast of CGE modeling. It's very difficult for them to construct a large, realistic, sophisticated model because that takes at least 2 man-years. Often they like to construct these very small models which are just supposed to illustrate a particular theoretical point. Yes, so what they're hoping to get from all of this is publications. So yes, so I find, and perhaps some of you will have found, that the reviewing process, although very annoying, is not a very good guarantee of quality. So supposing my paper, I submit a paper, it has a bad mistake, the probability that the referee will notice this mistake is maybe 5%. But if you were making the model for some customer who was paying you quite a large amount of money, they do tend to look at the results quite closely. So they are actually more severe critics than the typical academic referee. Yes, and the guy working for himself, just trying to get publications, he does not have this advantage. Another thing we used to see back then, not so much now, is so most CGE models were made by some professor from a rich country, typically USA, and then applied to a poor country. And the CGE model was part of a package of aid and even military assistance. Yes, and typically outside our centre and one or two others, there's no systematic training effort or transfer of skills. Okay, so here are some of the things that happened in the early days of the project. This is pretty significant. So up to this point, 1982, I think it was, the Irani model, in actuality, was a specialized Fortran program that only a few people could understand. And this meant that it was very hard to change any equation or add an equation because you would have to alter this computer program. But instead, we developed this more abstract system where the economist could write down the equations in a far simpler way, and then the computer would deal with this and generate a new Fortran program in a matter of half an hour. Okay, so what happened? I said there were 4 models in the original impact project, but 3 of them died. So, yes, so with the macro model, I couldn't say that our team was actually better at doing this than typical time series macro modelers. And it was the Treasury department who had the main responsibility for this stuff. And they really wanted to control it themselves. They didn't want a public macro model. They didn't want people saying, look, I fed into your model a slightly different assumption, and I get totally different conclusions. So that one died. The demographic model also died because, well, we were talking at lunch about Brazil and how it seemed 25 years ago that Brazil's population growth would level off very slowly, because actually it's very easy to do incredibly accurate demographic modeling for 5 years ahead. Yes, but then there are surprises, like the reduction in the Brazilian birth rate. But there was nothing in the Bachelor model which would help us predict a sudden reduction in fertility. So, and also in Australia, and maybe here too, I don't know, as soon as we start talking about how many children there should be in each family, this seems a little offensive and unfashionable. So, yes, so we don't like to talk about that too much. And then the long run model, the linear programming model, it became clear that a model like Irani could handle both long run and short run better than the linear programming model. So for those who are not familiar, so a linear programming model asks us which economic choice of the size of different industries, the allocation of different inputs, is best for the economy, assuming a number of constraints which traditionally are linear. Yes, so I'm trying to find the best option, assuming a lot of linear constraints, and it's almost inevitable that I'm going to find a corner solution. And this is what's meant by the flip-flop problem, a small change in the inputs to the linear programming model, leading to a very dramatic change in the outputs as you jump from one corner solution to the other. And the Australian model was rather apt to suggest, for example, that Australia's best strategy was to specialise completely in the production of chocolate or some other thing. So the outputs never seemed very realistic or convincing. So this also was forgotten. So here you see how our group has moved from one university to another. We've now been based at most of the universities in Melbourne. Yes, why do we keep moving? Well, one reason is that in order to pay for our activities, we insist that all of our consulting revenue, remember the university is not giving us money, so we say that all of our consulting revenue must be used for our salaries. But in Australian universities, and quite likely here also, the convention is that every time the government hands some money to the university, half goes to central administration, and 5% of that in Australia to the salary of the university leader. We now have these very highly paid university leaders, and they can see that our activities, doing consulting to pay our salaries, is not helping central administration or the salaries of the university leader at all. So they complain about this and demand that we give them half of the money, but we say, no, we just can't do that. We're competing against commercial consultants. Don't have to do that. Yes, and then there's a fight, and then we go to another university and say, listen, we're not going to cost you anything. We have quite a good publication record. We'll bring fame to your university. What about it? And they say, oh, it sounds good. But after 10 years, the pain of not getting half the money becomes too much for them. And there's another quarrel and we move on again. So I think we still have two universities in the city of Melbourne which we've not lived at so far. So we didn't quite exhaust the possible resting place. Yes, so this was a pivotal point. So in 1984, Professor Dixon, Peter Dixon, became the director of this institute, which was the main applied economic research department of Melbourne University, and historically associated with the tariff or protectionist lobby. So it was a very big thing that a well-known free trader had managed to become leader of the research institute, whose job it was to defend tariffs. And he turned the institute into a factory for CGE modeling. And we began to learn about the method of funding ourselves by doing consulting work. So up to that time, we had expected, as perhaps many of you might expect, that you would do your research and the government would pay your salary. Yes, that was the naive attitude we had then. But we began to learn there was another way. At first, only a contribution to our budget, but later growing a lot. We began to experiment with multi-period versions of the model, tracking the economy through time, which have become more and more important in our work. And then this guy, Tom Hertel, at that time a mid-career agricultural economist from Purdue University, came to be with us for a year and left with this big idea, the GTAP project, which borrowed on many of the features of our projects and had a staff connection as well for many years. Okay, so all this was going on during the late 70s and early 80s, while the centre-right government was in control. So we had a fairly low profile, but we were developing all these new tools and skills. And then the Labour government, the centre-left government came back. And once again, there was a demand for expert advice and, maybe worldwide, a sudden huge enthusiasm for slightly free market economics. Yes, so this was our golden time, really. There were so many people, both in the Australian Parliament and in the public service bureaucracy, who were sympathetic to economics and even understood a little bit, and were keen to commission various projects. Yeah, so it gave us many opportunities to do studies on all sorts of different problems. Yeah, so this is one of the, well, I find it amusing. Yes, so some study was done. In fact, the question was, should we reduce tariffs protecting the Australian auto industry? And as usual, the government asked us to do a study, and our study predicted that if there were no tariffs protecting the auto industry would shrink, but not disappear. Unemployment would be much less than you might have feared, and GDP would grow by 0.01%. A bit unusually, the auto lobby also commissioned a CGE model study from someone else, and that study concluded that that if we reduce the tariffs on auto, the auto industry would shrink a little bit, and GDP would fall by 0.01%. And some of the people in Parliament asked, how can it be that two CGE models come up with opposite conclusions? So even that was a bit wrong, because there isn't really a difference between an increase of 0.1% in GDP and a decrease in this context. But anyway, the Australian Parliament got interested in this question. Why does two CGE models give different answers? And a third study was done, and they discovered that this was because the two CGE models had made different assumptions about import substitution elasticities. Yeah, so this is the elasticity of substitution between local and imported goods, or even between two sources of imported goods. That's known as the Armington elasticity. And that tells you the slope of a certain triangle known as the Harburger triangle, which is a measure of the distortion loss from a certain tax. Yes, so the welfare loss or gain will depend a little bit on this Armington trade elasticity. Yeah, so now I'm getting technical, but it certainly seems extraordinary that a bunch of politicians in the Australian Senate would spend an afternoon discussing this point. But what happened was, by this time, there actually were about 3 senators who had attended our training courses, used the model or similar models, and actually had a detailed knowledge of this point. So they were prepared to get up and speak. And as usual in the Australian Parliament, there's about 20 politicians who like to give a long speech in every debate. So they also stood up and pretended to understand this point. Yes, so an afternoon was wasted in the Australian Senate. So here's a typical scenario of the day. So some issue arises. So Australia is a country of water shortage. 80% of our water is used by farmers, and yet they pay nothing. Maybe they should pay a little, and maybe this would divert scarce water into the types of agriculture where it's most useful. But of course, the farmers don't want to pay for their water. So a public inquiry is started. The different stakeholders are allowed to put their point of view. The Resource Ministry commissions a CGE study, and whatever are the conclusions of the CGE study, it requires that we place on the table some tables of numbers that everyone will agree on. So while we're still at this point in the debate, it's perfectly possible, in fact normal, for the different factions to have totally different ideas of the numbers involved, to be talking at cross purposes. So just putting this sheet of numbers on the table focuses the debate far more closely. And then if you're going to have a model, you're going to be saying, we assume that farmers did this, that sectors act in this way, and that also, perhaps not everyone will agree, but at least they know what they disagree about. if you can ask them to comment on a model. Anyway, and this would be a very typical conclusion. That it's true that farmers will suffer if they have to pay for water, but probably not nearly as much as they said. Yes, so, which is always true. So, yeah, so I remember a few years back, we had a terrible drought. And I think I have to explain to you Brazilians that, so when I say a terrible drought, I mean no rain for 7 years. Not no rain for 3 weeks. Yes, anyway, in this bad drought year, rainfall was only 10% of the norm, and the farmers were shouting that it was a disaster and they needed some big government subsidies straight away or else they'd disappear. Yes, and at the end of the year, wheat production was down 15%. So actually, the drought was not quite as catastrophic as they were claiming. The stakeholders are allowed to comment on the simulations. They might say that some assumptions are very unrealistic. There could be more simulations. But a more common response is that once we see how much the farmers are hurting, maybe there'll be some sort of compensation policy, some grants or transition programs to help them adjust to the new situation. And then finally, from the ministry's point of view, they have to produce a report of this process. And now they have this very impressive looking 50-page supplement to their report full of equations and numbers and pretty graphs. So that's good for them. Yes, I mentioned before that the Federal Treasury would like to think that it was the sole source of expertise in economic policy. And that is very annoying to some other departments. For example, we have a Department of Agriculture. They think they know something. And they can contribute to economic policy. And CGE modelling was a possible route for them to develop some counterweight or alternative centre of expertise to the Treasury. Yes. Okay, so our experience is, if you argue a point for 25 or 30 years, quite possibly at the end of that time, people will start agreeing with you. And I think you can see this a little bit with regard to the climate scientists. They started jumping up and down really in the 1990s. Not many people took any notice. Slowly, like water wearing away the stone, they start to have some effect. And this is what happened in Australia. Eventually, the tariffs were reduced. So this blue line is showing the rate of protection on manufacturing. And the orange line attempts to summarize a whole series of subsidies and protective measures which were helping agriculture. Yes, and you can see at the end, we've moved more or less towards a level playing field between the industries within Australia. and between Australian produced goods and imported goods. Yes, so we won sort of on that argument after quite a long time. Yes, so here's an example for our car industry. Recall we're about a tenth of the population of Brazil, but we had 5 car producers, all foreign owned, and all in Australia just because of this tariff war. And now they're all gone. Our auto industry has just vanished. Very similar story for the textile, clothing and footwear industry. It hasn't completely vanished, but it's more or less been entirely replaced by imports from Asia. Yes, and yet unemployment is lower than ever, and we're richer than ever. Yes, so so I don't know. So you can see I'm teasing you here because Brazil has not made this journey, and you do have the huge tariffs, and you've got all the auto producers. And could you really believe, could anyone possibly believe that if all the auto manufacturers disappeared, Brazil would be just as happy as today? If you believe our arguments, possibly. But anyway, somebody else has to keep shouting this message for 30 years before anything would happen in Brazil. Yeah, so this is the sort of thing that happens. So during COVID, there was a supply shortage, and it was discovered that we had a shortage of paracetamol and a number of other drugs. And people said, oh, this is very bad, we're vulnerable. We should have our own factories for making paracetamol, aspirin, face masks, and so on. Yes, but then the pandemic ended, and we didn't hear more about that. So here's the latest idea. So Australia can claim that we invented the solar panel. Many of the big breakthroughs occurred in the University of Sydney. The professor there had a very clever Chinese PhD student. That Chinese PhD student returned to China and more or less founded their enormous solar panel industry. Yes, but Australia's new idea is that we have the world comparative advantage in sunshine. So we're going to become a huge exporter of solar electricity, and we're going to make our own panels. Yes, which means, of course, we have to prevent the Chinese panels, which would be far cheaper getting to Australia. Yes, and developing a whole new industry using expertise we don't have, and I'm guessing handicapping ourselves, because in China there's very few environmental or safety regulations, and in Australia there would be. I'm sure that would increase the cost. Yes, so once again, I'm confident that we'll earn some money doing simulations showing that it's very hard to become a huge producer of solar electricity if you refuse to use the Chinese panel. So from the 1990s on, again, there was a period of centre-left government and an interest in Australia joining the world process of moving to less or even zero CO2 emissions. which for Australia seemed more of a challenge than it did at that time for Brazil. So yeah, so look at these emission numbers. So each Australian is emitting 17 tonnes. China, less than half of that, even though they're dependent on coal like Australia, and Brazil, a tiny fraction. Yes, but that's because in Brazil it's always raining, so you get to produce all this hydro, which we don't have in Australia because there's not much rain. So we've done an enormous amount of simulations on this, all really with the same conclusion, that we could reduce our emissions a great deal at a cost, but that cost is a relatively small fraction of GDP, and if you believe that somehow the CO2 is an existential threat to the way we live, that small cost is well worth paying. Yes, but we haven't had so much impact in that case. So the reason is that the fossil fuel companies have an enormous influence on Australian politics. Yes, and the governments have really just refused to move on this. So the centre-right government, although moderate in most respects, on the subject of climate change, they do sound like Trump or Bolsonaro. Half of them, or more than half, just don't believe it. They think it's some sort of conspiracy or nonsense. Yes, so for a little while, we had a look at either a CO2 tax or an emissions trading scheme. But again, industry opposition was too strong. And if you look at our current performance, okay, so this top line shows Australian CO2 emissions since 1990, made by burning various fuels in conventional ways. So that's what we mean. This LULUS stands for something like land use, land change. And as you'll know, if you chop down 1 million hectares of the Amazon, you release a fantastic amount of CO2. So it can seem, it probably is the case, that Brazilian CO2 emissions are dominated by what's happening in the Cerrado, what's happening at the edge of the Amazon due to this change in forest cover. And when we include in our calculations Australian promises to stop deforestation and even reforest, it's possible to argue that our emissions have remained stable. But I'm very skeptical of this, so let me tell you how it works. So I'm a farmer. I have some area of land which is very degraded. I promise to plant it with trees, and instantly I will get a carbon credit related to the carbon sequestered by those trees in 50 years' time. So that's good. Now let's say a big fire comes and burns all the trees when they're 15 years old. So the sequestration never happened. But perhaps I can now apply for another grant to plant the trees again. Yes, so there's reason to be very suspicious of these numbers, I claim, and to be very sad that we haven't managed to do anything about those numbers. Here are some other issues that we've been important in. Yes, so we had at one time a very strong mining boom. So what we mean by Dutch disease is that when we have a very strong export boom, resources are sucked towards the expanding sector, and the other sectors, especially trade competing sectors, suffer from the rise in prices caused by the resources boom. So it was quite interesting and important to measure or predict that sort of thing. A big thing for Australia, the transition from an arbitrary collection of different taxes to a single GST or value-added tax. All sorts of infrastructure projects. Yes, so what would be the effect of a new railway between two regions? What would be the effect of a sports stadium, this sort of thing? As you're starting to wonder in Brazil, what will be the social or economic impacts of a world where there are far more retired people? Yes. So, for example, in Australia, quite a large economic sector are what we call aged care homes, where people typically over 80 go to live because there's no one to look after them. So I think this is a very small sector in Brazil at this time, but it's pretty obvious if you think about it, it's going to be growing a lot. To try and quantify what that means for the economy. Another interesting idea, Australia is relying on foreign investment. So in general, Australian savings are not enough to pay for the tremendous amount of investment we need. So we have to borrow money from foreigners. Perhaps they would be keener to lend us money if we didn't tax their profits. That's what they argue. So, yes, so we can attempt to model that. And our conclusion was that Australia was a little bit better off if we tried to claw back some of the profits of these foreign companies, even if that slightly reduced inward foreign investment. Okay, so here's a new CGE application, which is proving quite profitable for us. And I noticed that my colleague Edson Dominguez in Belo Horizonte is starting to do this as well. Disaster simulation. Yes, so these disasters, forest fires, earthquakes, tsunamis, outbreak of foot and mouth disease, the terrorist attack. So the special features are they're quite often confined to a small area and a relatively small amount of time. Yes, so we now have models which have very many small regions, and we can even run them in a quarterly or monthly way. So we're able to separate three very different effects of a disaster. So there's the initial one. often the first 2 weeks. The tsunami washed over, the relief effort was needed. Then an effort to rebuild all the infrastructure which was destroyed. And then, maybe for a very long time, attempting to pay back the money that was spent rebuilding after the disaster. Yeah, so in Australia, I don't know if you have this in Brazil, but perhaps we'll see it one day. So we have these government agencies with names like the Disaster Planning Agency, and their job is to be ready with a plan in case there's a disaster, and make sure that there are the emergency services and other resources ready to cope with the disaster. But from their point of view, months and years go by and there is no disaster. Yeah, so imagine being the Australia's premier tsunami expert. A lifetime can go by with no tsunami, so you tend to feel undervalued. Yes, but if they commission the study from us, they can get some idea of what the cost of the disaster would be, with and without their wonderful plan. So this gives them some argument for continuing their funding, even though there was no disaster in the last 5 years. And we've managed to export this model quite widely. So yeah, so now I'm a little shocked to say the US military is quite an important source of our income. So they would like to know what would be the cost of a terrorist attack in a certain region of Poland, or indeed an earthquake somewhere. Yes, so this is a new area that we've been working on. Yes, so yes, so I'm told that there is someone in this audience who actually teaches input-output modeling. But here I'm talking about a particular sort of input-output modeling, which is very common, and is essentially about some remote or rural region trying to argue that it would be a very good idea if Brasilia or someone else spent a lot of money building a thing in their region. So it could be a football stadium, it could be a bridge, and in this context, input-output modeling is often used to suggest that somehow there's a magic formula to create resources, and in this made-up example, each dollar spent in Giovancina generates $5 of national GDP, and therefore, perhaps, Brasilia will be able to recover this dollar from general taxation. So the increase in output and employment doesn't really cost anything. Okay, so what's the hidden assumption there? That labor and capital are not in short supply, but can just be hired as needed at the same old price. Yes, so so after a while, Australian politicians have become tired of this sort of argument. And in particular, whereas 25 years ago, the idea that hosting a major sporting event was necessarily a good thing for the economy. So everyone would have assumed that was true. Slowly, it's come home to Australian state and national government that these sporting events are not actually a very good way to spend money. So this whole business of the multipliers has gone out of fashion a bit. And now if you looked on our Bureau of Statistics website, it states that they refuse to supply the multipliers, which they used to do. Yes, because they don't really believe that they're a very good thing to do. And that is the end. I thank you for your patience.